We have achieved great things. We have made giant leaps. We've gone far beyond what we thought was possible. But we have only just begun. Our future in space is unlimited, and it will benefit all humanity. But it will take hard work, new technologies, advanced financing models, and enabling public policy. The Beyond Earth Institute is creating a policy and legal framework to enable the creation of economically vibrant communities beyond Earth. We will engage all stakeholders on critical policy issues: property rights in space, norms of behavior, conflict resolution protocols, filling the technology gaps, exploring new financing mechanisms, and making space settlement an agreed goal of the U.S. and its allies. Beyond Earth is committed to the true purpose of why we go to space. Join us on this journey.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Beyond Earth Institute webinar. My name is Steve Wolf. I'm the president and co-founder of the Beyond Earth Institute. And welcome to today's webinar, which is titled The New Order for China and India's Beyond Earth Human Spaceflight Program, a space race by any other name. Before we introduce the program, I just want to talk to you a little bit about something special that's coming up that hopefully all of you are aware of. It is the Beyond Earth Symposium. It is our third installment of this fabulous program where we put on in Washington, D.C. It's a day and a half of intensive policy discussion and with folks who are interested in the mission of the Beyond Earth Institute. There's going to be a lot going on. If you haven't registered already, please do so. There is only limited seating, and we're currently still in the early bird registration rates, so certainly you want to take advantage of that. Just a couple of highlights I want to point out. The ambassador to the United States from Italy, Mariangela Zappia, is our official chairperson of the program, indicative of the fact that this is an international program, and our today's program is a reflection of this international nature of the Beyond Earth Institute. Karen Feldstein, Associate Administrator of NASA, will be there. We'll have an intensive discussion on the transition into the new administration. This will include Scott Pace, who's the former head of the National Space Council. Lori Garver, former Associate Administrator of NASA, will be part of that discussion, and others. We will have a serious discussion on commercial space stations in LEO and how do we transition from what is the current status of transitioning from the ISS. We will talk very aggressively about the cislunar environment. How do we ensure that the economy based upon lunar activities is going to come to fruition? We're going to look at the human factors as well, and particularly with a focus on artificial gravity. We are way overdue with a serious discussion and serious research into artificial gravity as an important component of mitigating the negative health effects of the space environment. We are going to have an awesome conversation around economic planning for economic zones on the moon. So this is an interesting concept. Can we create an economic zone on the moon, and how would that look, and how do we structure that, and what would be the framework of that? That will be a fascinating conversation we're having there. And actually, we're going to be issuing a paper that's going to be associated with this directly. We'll have a panel of ambassadors from other nations to talk about what will space diplomacy mean in the future in the emerging space communities. And we're very excited on the fun side that Ron Moore, who is the showrunner and creator of a popular show called For All Mankind, will be featured, will be with us live for a conversation. We're looking forward to that. That'll be fun. If folks know him, he was involved with Star Trek and Battlestar Galactica and so forth. So he's very much in line with our thinking about the future of space. So I encourage you all to sign up today if you can. We'll put the link in the chat field for everyone, and look forward to seeing you there. So now to our program. Um, we certainly know that there is a growing global interest in human spaceflight, beyond the U.S. What the U.S. has done. China has a very robust human space program, as we know. India, Japan, others are vying to play in that field. That's what we're going to discuss today with our panel. It'd be very robust. It'll be led by our Beyond Earth Executive Vice President, Courtney Stadd. And they'll discuss what are the benefits, what are the challenges, how do we navigate this new dynamic from a national and international perspective with this a tremendous panel that he's gathered. So with that, I want to turn the program over to you, Courtney, for your able hands. Courtney, of course, has provided enormous leadership to the Beyond Earth, and anyone in Washington knows that that Courtney has been a leader in the space policy community for decades. So with that, Courtney, I'll turn the program over to you.
All right. Thank you, Steve, very much. And a call out to Lauren Andrade, who's the exceptional talent who's has so many senior leadership roles at the Beyond Earth, including helping to coordinate the symposia. I want to thank Lauren and Bram, who's behind the scenes helping the technical support. One more comment before I move on to the webinar. The Space Symposium timing is indeed critical. It does come after the election, and we have 4 working groups, again being coordinated actually by Lauren, and we expect 4, perhaps as many as 5 working papers, and those will be the basis of inputs to the transition team. Whichever candidate wins will be feeding those into the new administration. So another reason I would humbly suggest for as many of you as possible to sign up, register, and make your voice felt on November 12th and 13th at the Space Symposium. And I want to thank all of you for taking time for this, what I think is a very timely, critical topic. And speaking of you, the audience, yesterday I attended a space forum whose name I'll avoid mentioning since it was hosted by friends and populated by numerous speakers I respect. But for whatever reason, no questions from the audience were allowed. Well, for those of us at Beyond Earth, you, the audience, you're really a fundamental part of what makes these discussions informative. More often than not, your comments and questions help to ensure that our discussions are on point and
Hey, Courtney, are you there? Lauren, are you there? Can you hear me?
by introductory observations by our panelists, and then I'll follow up with some initial questions. And as I do so, again, I trust many of you will submit your thoughts and questions in the chat room. I've also encouraged our panelists to put in whatever resource links they think are germane to the topic, so all of you could follow up as you see fit. As Americans living in the richest superpower with our impressive history of space first, including the moon landing, and leading a global alliance in building International Space Station, and reading in the daily trade press about the latest US-based commercial space venture, it's all too easy to take for granted the future of Beyond Earth human space community is driven and shaped by the United States. It's all too natural to assume that the lingua franca of the cosmos will be English. But Steve Wolf, Lauren Andrade, and I thought it timely to question that premise head on. Given the rapid pace of human spaceflight developments in China and India that Steve referenced, and others coming up the rear, we wanted to bring together our panel of thought leaders and level set as to how the human spaceflight geopolitical landscape seems to be dramatically changing, and get down to it as to what's the reality, what are the facts, what does this mean for the future of human spaceflight? Are we ushering in the same old Earth-based geopolitical fault lines into outer space? Now, the bios for today's panelists are online, so no reason to eat up time with reading those very impressive resumes. But I'll give a quick intro for each panelist before they speak. And with that, I'm going to start with Peter Garretson. And I've had the great pleasure of working with all of the panelists in one form or another. And they're all just really top-notch, world class, starting with Peter. He's a former senior officer, Air Force. He's a currently senior fellow with the American Foreign Policy Council, where he and his colleagues, Rich Harrison, among others, author well-researched reports on the global space domain, including China and India. And by the way, I highly recommend the next space race written in collaboration with his colleague, Richard Harrison. So with that, Peter, let me turn it over to you for a few minutes to level set. I know you have a couple of charts you want to take the audience through. So over to you, Peter.
Absolutely. It doesn't look like I'm able to start my video. Am I blocked from that?
Steve or Bram, can we help Peter?
All right, there we go.
Ah, perfect.
Well, before I start any slides, let me just provide some thoughts. So certainly it's a very different world than the first space race where there were just two superpowers. Now we have, a diversity of major space capable states, and we have quite a large number of middle powers that are at least partially space capable, and they're all sort of vying for the attention of the other states in the world, and the motivations are diverse. You still have the same motivations for status and prestige, specifically as it relates to sort of building coalitions, finding partners, but you also have also sort of similar, military concerns, principally about counter space, less about nuclear. But now you've also got this concept, this interest that space might be relevant and important economically. And so, I wanted to provide a little bit of some thoughts about what we're seeing emerging. So let me just share this. So I would say the first thing is it's not really a single race. It's more like a decathlon where nations are competing in multiple events, all of which have interactions. And of course, right now we're all watching what Starship is doing, but it's amazing if you saw in the last couple days the Chinese attempt to do something very similar to Falcon 9 that almost successfully landed. Then, there's this large global effort to move towards space stations and the broader LEO industrialization. Of course, there's intense competition on mega constellations. There's the military aspect of counter space and space mobility and logistics. Then there's the entire lunar base race and the desires for lunar industrialization. There's a whole separate event on space-based solar power and the enabling ISAM, or in-space assembly and manufacturing. Eventually, you're going to see, Mars and the Martian moons become their own sort of mini space race for sort of resource exploration. And then you see space nuclear power and propulsion as sort of a separate event. There's asteroid mining, and then of course there's planetary defense, and each of these carries with them diplomatic coalitional influence and public diplomacy, military and economic and industrial implications and potential advantages. Now, most of you guys are probably familiar with the Artemis Accords, and you may have seen this slide of all the Artemis Accords signatories. I've built at the bottom a comparative slide of all the state actors that are part of the International Lunar Research Station, which is the China-Russia attempt. And then if we want to look at these same things on a map, and I will point out that while India is a major subject of this and is truly a space power in their own right and is doing many of the sort of activities that you would see of somebody seeking a pole in the international system, and they have very recently announced a major increase in their funding and interest in human spaceflight, to go to space regularly, to have a space station, and to have a human presence on the moon, and including putting as much as $1 billion towards a new reusable launch vehicle. They are teamed with the United States on the Artemis Accords, which is a fairly major happening in terms of how things are shaking out. So if I look at this same data on the map, you can see, here that the states in blue are states that are part of the Artemis Accords, and the states in red are the ones that are formally part of the International Lunar Research Station. The states in pink are cooperating as part of the ILRS, but through an NGO. And then you've got a few states that are Artemis partners, but are also teamed, usually with some NGO or university participation in the other side. So, all these unascribed powers, are essentially being wooed by both sides to say, where do they want to go? And China and Russia have been doing a lot in terms of space-related transactions. This is credit to the Prague Security Institute that has done a great job mapping what sorts of international agreements exist between China and Russia and what they call the ground-based space race. And then, of course, there's the interesting reality that the United States and the Artemis partners and the ILS folks are looking at some of the same places where they might go on the South Pole. Now, I should also point out that at the moment, the United States and basically nobody else has recently successfully put down landers, but the Chinese and the Indians have. So at the moment, in terms of having a credible capability to actually go to the moon, both China and India are ahead. And then, I would also say that when we think about long-term, scalability for, human communities living beyond space, it's very important to look at what else folks are doing that enable the scale and the economics that might make that possible. In the same way that Elon Musk is looking at Starlink as a way to finance his desires to bring humans to Mars, it's important to look, I think, at what nations are looking at in terms of space solar power. And China in particular has this very aggressive and ambitious timeline to put up a gigawatt class demonstrator in the 2030 time period that would dwarf the International Space Station and become the biggest man-made object in space. And you can see it here in about 10 football fields in size, collecting about 24 megawatts. You can also see I've put this in direct scale against both the International Space Station on the bottom here and the Senate Launch System on the left. So those are some initial thoughts, and I'll stop there and see if there's anything else.
Excellent. And I agree with Nicholas Nelson in the audience, who said that decathlon is a perfect metaphor. That's wonderful. You do what you always do, Peter. You really did an excellent job of setting the stage. Let me move to George Pullen. George, in my humble opinion, is one of the best space economists around. He's a partner chief economist with Milky Way Economy, a forecasting strategy for what George and his colleagues refer to as the fifth industrial revolution of the space economy. But George, believe me, is no ivory tower academic. He brings a lot of very hands-on practical experience, including working with the U.S. Commodity Futures Trading Commission, and then a lot of work in the street, Wall Street, as a trader, portfolio manager, and banker. And I've had the honor of working with him in one early start commercial company, and he brings a tremendous amount of insight to that world. So with that, George, let me give you a few minutes to hold forth on how you view this world that Peter was just describing.
Sure. Well, thank you for having me here again, Courtney. And I think Peter did a great setup. I'll do my disclaimer, which is I do wear a lot of hats, like Courtney mentioned. I also teach. I have teaching appointments both with Columbia in their summer program and the University of New Hampshire Franklin Pierce Law School. But today I am just George here talking to all you guys, sharing with you what I believe to be the economic outlook and how that economic outlook interplays with the expanding presence of both China and India and other actors in the burgeoning space economy, which I refer to as the fifth industrial revolution. I think we should level set, right? So I think I'm usually here to bring the numbers. So let's start there. If you look at a variety of estimates for what the size of the future space economy could be, that really can help shape and ground, haha, space joke, it can ground thinking around the type of efforts and the type of money and attention that this part of the economy will get. So the space economy right now is still somewhere between 450 and 650, depending on whose numbers you like, billion. Okay, that's with a B. There has been recent reports that have come out that have placed the number closer to a 1.7 or even perhaps even 2 trillion by 2030. Milky Way Economy has been putting out a 4 trillion in the 2040s number for a while. For any of you who are entrepreneurs, that was cited in Forbes, so you're welcome to use it. But really the big number is the 10 trillion in the 2050s number. And that number doesn't come from Milky Way Economy. It doesn't come from NASA. That actually comes from the Chinese Space Agency. So they really recognize that there is an opportunity of cislunar economic activity that could really be meaningful, because when you start talking about something that isn't just 1 or 2 trillion, but really, you know, in that 4, 5, 6, even $10 trillion range, that's a meaningful contribution to the overall economy of the Earth, right? So the overall Earth economy is only a little bit north of 100 trillion today. So you're talking a meaningful percentage of the economy, because the idea is that the space economy will grow faster than the global economy. And so that percentage should be increasing steadily over time. Okay, so that's why there's such an interest, both for commercial participants, but also for national participants. I think there are nations participating that might have a one-part vanity project, one-part economic incentive here, but the economic incentives are very much real. I think another thing that's important to talk about, and this comes up from time to time, and so as the economic professor in the room, I'm going to say it. We have to remember purchasing power parity. Now, for everyone who took Economics 101 and is getting a little shell shocked, don't worry. I'm not going to go all the way into purchasing power parity, but just keep in mind that a dollar spent here isn't the same as a dollar in certain national currency spent someplace else. Okay, so a lot of times people talk about, oh, well, you know, look at the amazing things China is doing, or look at the amazing thing India is doing, or look at the amazing things insert country is doing. You know, why isn't the US doing more? Well, remember that purchasing power parity really does level set some of these spending patterns, right? If I spend $1 in the US, that's not the same as if I spend the equivalent amount in India or China or someplace else. And so oh, they're coming for me. Sorry about that. You live in DC, you're going to hear sirens. That's just how this works, boys and girls. So anyway, so I just want to level set there on purchasing power parity. I think we'll get more into it later. I'm also a big fan of Peter's books. I'm very proud to have contributed to 1 or 2 of his chapters in his latest. And so please go pick up his book. If you're interested in any of mine, I'll drop it in the LinkedIn and you can, you know, find me as you see fit. But I point to that because part of this economic growth model includes the population of space stations, commercial space stations. And so Milky Way Economy, we forecast that there will be 8 to 12 commercial space stations in that 2040 timeframe. That many commercial space stations are going to be a big part, a major part of this economic activity that we forecast. And so other nations are going to want to participate in that economic activity. They're going to want their companies part of it. They want to provide their goods and services to that economy. And so I think about commercial space stations. I think Peter was right to point out the development on the moon, although I'm not sure if in this time frame that I bound myself with, good economists, they bound themselves on time frames, you know, past the decade mark, if we're really talking about how much commercial activity versus how much state-sponsored for efficiencies purposes commercial activity, right? But I think around commercial space stations, you're going to see a lot of growth there, and I think you're going to see a lot of competition there between national actors. So after that, I'll look forward to our discussion period, Courtney.
Thank you, George, very much for that. be prepared. I'm sure when you mentioned X number of commercial habitats or space stations, there might have been a little bit of skepticism among some of our audience. So please, at some point, not right now, but as we get into it, to hear your thoughts on why you think there is a market for those many stations. But nonetheless, thank you very much for your comments. I'd like now to move to Rose Crociere, who I've gotten to know over the last number of years, particularly when she worked at the nonprofit, where I believe she still is a non-resident fellow at the Center for Global Development. And I had the honor of participating in one of her workshops, looking at technology, supporting countries, Africa, et cetera, adoption of space-related technology. And ultimately, her handbook for space capability development came out in 23. So if I may, Rose, if you're able to provide a link to that in the chat room, that'd be great at the appropriate time. Rose current hat, and she's coming to us as the International Relations Specialist in the Office of Space Commerce in the Department of Commerce. And she's leading the U.S.-India sub-working group on commercial space. And I can't think of a better person who, by the way, has also lived abroad in outside the Western world. So she has a really hands-on background that she brings to the topic. With that, Rose, over to you.
Wow, thank you so much, Courtney. I really appreciate the introduction. And yeah, I started out at the Center for Global Development, and now I work for the Department of Commerce, and it's really fun because it's very hands-on and things that you can think through at a think tank. You're able to put into action in cooperation with colleagues and leadership on the ground with the dominant space leader in the world that is still in the United States. But let me just kind of big picture, true for myself, and I think for commerce in general, we at the Office of Space Commerce are really approaching this from a community perspective. I mean, of course, we want the United States to succeed. We want U.S. industry to grow, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's always a zero-sum game. And the reality is, space is big, and we fully expect as the decades roll on that more and more actors will be participating. And so we're really interested and we're focused on developing a good environment where all of these actors can work and play together. So that can talk about, we get into how we manage risk.
Rose, forgive me, don't lose your train of thought. Your words are coming across, but a couple of members of the audience asked if the microphone could be brought a little closer for them, a little bit of garbling, but we are able to hear, but it might help. Try that.
I will speak louder and slower, and hopefully
they'll do it. Thank you. Go ahead. I hope I didn't break your train of thought. Thank you.
No. It's good to know. It doesn't do anything if nobody can understand me. So thinking about developing, a better environment for U.S. industry, for the global economy, and that means we have to be able to work together. We have to be able to compete fairly, and really that's a U.S. strength. If we're given a level playing field, our ingenuity, our energy, does tend to result in growth for U.S. companies, and really some very tangible benefits for the world. And I could point back to Starlink, for example, and other companies that are so active in telecommunications that are steadily driving down the cost of access, for example, to the internet in remote locations. And there's dozens of examples we could talk about. The variety and competition that has really brought kind of democratized access to space. So some other things I wanted to mention at Commerce, for the environment, we're doing a lot of kind of quiet foundation building. For example, there's really big numbers put out there about expectations on space growth, and there's a wide set of opinions on where that's going because it's very hard to predict. Commerce, particularly the Bureau of Economic Analysis, is working on space statistics to more precisely define what we mean by space industry, and also set up apples to apples kind of comparisons between us and other countries, so we can all just make better decisions. And also I just wanted to flag my colleagues at the National Institute of Standards and Technology who are developing a lot of just technical standards that are available for public and private use and are available to international bodies as well. Some were purchased and some are posted, but a lot of that, government funded work is part of what is encouraging this growth and kind of giving it a push forward versus every company having to figure it out for themselves at every step of the way. The Department of Commerce, specifically Office of Space Commerce, works to foster conditions to grow our space sector. And I think an important link and why I'm truly happy to be there, help the US government and our partners best leverage that space capability to point out, when it makes sense to use a product or service that's available with our private sector versus investing those, scarce US, public dollars into particular capabilities. To do that, we do a lot of advocacy, internal and external. We also have a new operational mission, TRACS, which is a space situational awareness system, and a role we're taking on from the Department of Defense. So that again comes back to how to create a safe, workable environment in space that applies to US and the globe. And we're working through a lot of regulation issues. So overall, I just wanted to kind of set the stage that from the Department of Commerce point of view, we're working on supporting industry, help them manage risk to include these geopolitical challenges as we go forward decades long, and very pragmatic, immediate things. How do we handle procurements? How does the US government do it? How do other countries do it? How can we take best advantage of commercial space? And of course, to be able to continue to operate in space, near Earth and further away, it has to be in a sustainable manner. We have to be able to have processes and compatibility, so it's a little bit smoother. And of course, overall, just good governance, reaching all the way back to the original Outer Space Treaty from the 1960s. So I think it's a good start, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation today. Thank you for organizing it.
Thank you very much, Rose. And as we get into the conversation, if you could also think about what I'm sure is on the mind of some of the audience. Your portfolio, your office's portfolio is, by definition, it's global, it's cosmic. So you're going to have to obviously deal with the Chinas, the Indias, and the others in terms of space traffic coordination and so forth and so on. So your thoughts on that as we get into the discussion will be useful. And I realize that some of your opinions may be Rose's, and so we'll be sensitive to when you're speaking for yourself and for the office.
I will differentiate that. Right now, just my opinion and the official Commerce opinion on this are well aligned.
Fair enough. Thank you, Rose, again. Well, last but certainly far from least is Kara Kunzman, who I have grown really fond of as well over the years. I've had the honor of participating in a number of meetings led by Kara. She brings a formidable technical engineering policy chops to all discussions. She is the founder and director of Strategic Foresight, which I trust she will quickly explain, at least give us a top-level explanation, within the Center for Space Policy and Strategy at the Aerospace Corporation. And for those of you in the audience who've not been tracking the output from that center, it's quite formidable and very, very informative in a whole array of space policy related topics. So I encourage everyone to please take a look at the Aerospace Center for Space Policy and Strategy. Prior to working in aerospace, Kara held roles in space systems engineering, vehicle ops, space sensor development, Raytheon, General Atomics. She brings a lot of just very programmatic, practical experience to the table. So with that, Kara, I turn it over to you.
Thanks, Courtney. Also, just really great to be here with my fellow panelists. We've had lots of, I think, meaty conversations on this topic over the years. So, I'm sure we're going to get in even deeper. So really looking forward to that. So maybe just a little bit about what being a professional futurist means and a little bit of background on that before I give some kind of opening commentary, tying together what I thought were three really good perspectives from the other panelists. So as Courtney mentioned, I lead a team within the Center for Space Policy and Strategy at Aerospace. Aerospace is a federally funded research center, so we're non-for-profit, bipartisan. We provide objective analysis across primarily the US national security and civil and commercial space apparatus, but we do work with international allies and partners and the private sector a bit. And so we're kind of like a think tank within an FFRDC. And my team in particular is a bit unusual in that we don't do necessarily traditional space policy. We have other amazing experts with deep expertise on specific policy issues. My team is really focused on advancing methodologies for kind of interrogating uncertain futures and managing uncertainty. So for those that are, I guess, intimidated by the phrase strategic foresight, it just means better approaches for managing uncertainty. So with that, I mean, I loved, Peter's opening kind of commentary, just kind of articulating, it's not a race, it's races plural. And I think there's probably even more than 3 dimensions to consider in this set of competition and cooperation and complexities with that. And I think we're really facing, as a nation, as an international community, as a civil sector, as, national security, all these different facets as we look into more players in space, obviously advancing geopolitical changes, really exciting prospects. I mean, George, I had not heard of a $10 trillion space economy, but does that get me really thinking and excited about a potential future to consider. So we have all these kind of different pieces coming together. And it really is ripe for, I think, a lot of uncertainty. And quite frankly, I think ripe for leadership to step up and help drive that, whether that's through policy, investments, partnerships, messaging, you name it. So I didn't know if I was going to get the green light to do this today, but I did get it. As some of you may be aware, the Center for Space Policy and Strategy puts out every 4 years Space Agenda, which is essentially a compendium of what we think are the most critical emerging space topic areas for the incoming administration. And we specifically do this before an election because we want objective analysis on what we think the critical issues are, not just necessarily what the handful of issues that any particular party should care about. And so this will drop next month. However, I think the introduction, which I authored, was really led by a lot of the work that we've done on the foresighting side, which is thinking about all of the uncertainties in this playing field, thinking about all the whys, right? We heard Courtney and Steve talk about, the why we go to space, and there are so many different whys, and that's a great thing. And understanding, I think all of the dynamics that go with that. So I guess I just wanted to take the few minutes in my introductory remarks to kind of walk through what we felt like were some of the key findings out of that. And you'll be able to kind of dig in deeper once we go live next month with it. But I think it's really pertinent to the discussion we're about to have, kind of as this panel and community. So we were able to kind of, Space Agenda is really designed to kind of focus on what we think are the most pressing policy issues that actually need tangible action and movement on over the next, 4 years or less. And so there's lots of important issues, but I think there was a really interesting question here about, if the U.S. right wants to kind of grab the reins and continue to lead and continue to shape space that benefits, free economy and more democratic values, then there are some things that we're going to have to really step up over the next 4 years if we want to see things move in that direction. So the overall Space Agenda called out about 20 critical issues that we outlined for which, there's some real movement that needs to be made over the next 4 years. And we understand that's a lot for anybody to try to take on, but there's a lot of things happening. And we tiered that by different categories. So one was, behind the curve, things like space debris, for example, and management of that. Like, we're behind the curve. It's just a matter of time. Like, we've got to do something. And then we have some emerging and urgent issues. Think, emerging kind of like destabilization of national security, space issues, nukes in space, opening that up, and violating the Outer Space Treaty. Those are definitely things that are pressing and need to get worked pretty much right away. But then there's these other issues, which traditionally kind of like are put on the back burner, but they're actually really critical for us to be investing in right now today. Things like investing in how we're going to connect adjacent industries and making strategic investments to make sure our commercial markets are economically viable over the long term and can actually create markets that don't exist that can thrive on their own and bring benefits back to the American people. So those are just some examples of some of these issues and approaches that really need to put the limelight on. But if you step back, we really kind of call out there is a requirement. The environment that we find ourselves today, the kind of uncertainty, the kind of disruption, the kind of, I think, value proposition, which I think I heard somebody else talk about, that space can bring to the table at a national level, it requires us to develop a long-term vision for space. And that is an urgent need. And I think the American people need to be able to understand, right, the value that it has in their national interests. So that needs to be articulated. And we also say, kind of outside of space, we need to expand our capacities for managing uncertainty. We are largely stovepipe and decision-making processes. Much of that is by design. Space is absolutely no exception to that. It's as my colleagues at Department of Commerce can attest, it's, every time you have to coordinate, it's across, 17 different agencies. You got to, get in consensus quickly on that. It can be very, very difficult. But if we can't figure out how to move into kind of national strategic planning beyond reactionary here and now crises, we're not going to be able to do big things. We're not going to be able to do amazing things. We're not going to be able to have humans in space at scale. We're not going to be able to have a $10 trillion space economy. So, those were some of the really, I think, important things that kind of came out of this body of work. It's less about, I think, the specific issue, and I think more about the recognition and mindset that we really are in a completely different era. This is not the Cold War. We are in something completely different. And I think we all have got to wake up and realize, I think, both the, risks that we have at a national level, but also the opportunity. This is why I love the title of this. It's like things are changing and there's so much opportunity. So I'm really looking forward, I think, to having a balanced discussion for both sides about what does this changing environment mean, not just for the US, but also globally. So I'll hand it back to you, Courtney.
You hit it out of the park, Kara. Thank you so much. And just, you framed it exactly as I knew you would, and I thank you for that. So Peter, let me go back to you. You and I have had some offline chats about whether the government as structured today in the civil military domains, policymaking, so forth, really is structured for the world that Kara was just outlining and that you outlined in your presentation. So I'm wondering, given all the studies you've done, the workshops you've conducted, looking at the realities facing the U.S., and again, trying, as Kara alluded to avoid the sort of binary us versus them space race type view that came out of the Cold War, what are your perspectives on how the U.S. needs to address these challenges abroad, and are there strategic opportunities to collaborate with these countries? Is it all on an adversarial basis? So I realize I'm throwing a lot at you, but like to get your initial perspectives.
Well, Courtney, first of all, I think it's best to start with your question about what are the opportunities. And I think there are tremendous opportunities ahead. I think that, obviously I'm a national security thinker, so I always think about what could go wrong and how do you structure the environment so that the least bad things can happen. But at the same time, I want to say that, I think the principal motivation of states right now is economic development and economic uplift. And so, the opportunities, I think, between the United States and China is to make sure that, as we move in that direction, there's the same kind of, rule sets for economic development that you might see on Earth, and that we can sort of keep it to, sort of friendly competition. On the other hand, we absolutely want to win that friendly competition. So then the opportunity becomes, how do we, with our Artemis partners, provide the best possible opportunity to sort of integrate our economies? What is the opportunity for some kind of a special, ITAR or free trade zone? And what is the opportunity for a new institution like an organization like the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development? So when you think about space or the moon specifically as an economic development zone, I think thinking about the Marshall Plan in Europe and all the Bretton Woods organizations is not a bad place to start. So, China, of course, is very serious about economic infrastructure development, competition on Earth. So if we, I would expect to see, that not just their Belt and Road space corridor, space for Earth, but I would expect that China will eventually step into a similar type of infrastructure development and multinationalism in space. So we need to be thinking on those same terms. They'll have their equivalent of a, Asia Development Bank. What is our equivalent of a World Bank in space, of an IMF in space? How are we looking for something like an ICAO in space, an OECD in space? And sort of specifically, thinking about that in the context of economic development on the moon. And I would say that, in my view, the biggest deficit in where Artemis needs to go is that Artemis has been, in my view, completely mischaracterized in the presidential intent. If you read SPD-1 and you read a new vision for space exploration and development that came out of the last administration, it's very clear that our principal reasons for going to the moon are neither prestige nor science. They are to build an industrial economy on the moon and to provide economic uplift. And I don't think that's sufficiently part of the narrative, but I think that's absolutely material to why nations are interested in participating and why they should want to join it. So I would say that, the biggest opportunity for whoever is the next administration is to start talking about Artemis as an economic uplift platform for the states who are participating. And that also requires a restructuring of our investments in NASA. So much more on in situ resource utilization, much more on in-space manufacturing, and the State Department's talking points, as well as NASA's talking points, needs to move more into that realm. And of course, center of that, is India. India, of all of our Artemis partners, is probably today and almost certainly in the future going to be the most capable space partner that we have. And so it'll be important that the United States and India try to ever more centralize what they're attempting to do in Artemis as sort of the fundamental structure that the other partners are going to build around.
Gotcha. Thank you, Peter. And thank you all for coming back on camera. This is part where we have our group discussion. And again, encouraging the audience to provide comments and questions. Let me pull on one of the threads from Peter, and maybe get George and then Rose and Kara's view. Is this an opportunity today, almost a Bretton Woods equivalent post-war, and for the younger people, I'm referring to World War II, where the United States played such a critical post-war architect in the economic and political global landscape in the Western world. And I'm wondering if this is an opportunity, George, starting with you, to think big, think about new economic empowering organizations that help address the priority issues that Kara referred to, for example, and Peter referred to. George, what's your, and by the way, George, I'm not letting you off the hook. At some point, I do want to get your insight into what market would be the basis for those 8+ commercial space stations. There you are.
It's one word, it's biotech.
Okay.
But no, so for the economic part of this discussion, and I think it weaves in practically one for one when we talk about national defense and some of the points that Peter had brought up. When we're talking about having economic strength and economic zones of activity, we're really talking about generating the types of commercial activities that benefit everyone, right? Within my lifetime, there will still be less people in space than on Earth. I'm very confident that statement. And so using that as a, as a gauge, those additional people, and I'll go so far as to say those additional activities, which might not all involve people, happening off planet are going to return value, real value here to Earth. And so when we think about how do we share those activities, how do we share the economic benefits being generated, the best way that we can put ourselves in a position to win is to be in a position that we're the ones who have the infrastructure, we're the ones that are providing the financial tools, we're the ones that are providing the deterrence and defense for those assets. And that creates a system under which the US maintains its hegemony, right? So I'm sorry if my Marine Corps showing, but that's also important to me, okay? And so with that in mind, that is a mechanism for us to bring global partners in, right? When you know that as a scientist located in ABC country, that the newest piece of biotechnology you're working on can be successfully tested on the space station, and the space station is launched and serviced by a U.S. firm. It's being protected. There are freedom of movement. It knows it's not going to be it knows it's not going to run to adversarial space assets by other countries. That sets up a mechanism of risk reduction. And as any rational economic actor would want, you have to have these risk reduction mechanisms in place. And so I think when we talk about defense and deterrence in space, it's defense and deterrence for a system and architecture around our infrastructure and around our push out of economic activity. And that allows us to bring our partners with us, to bring our allied nations with us. I've used the expression space race 2.0 as a relay race before. I do like the decathlon one. I'm going to have to work that in now. But it's an idea of, believe it or not, I did used to race. You pass the baton back and the guy behind you grabs it and then they keep going, right? But you can't slow down, right? During the pass, that's like the hardest part. And so when you think about that in space, it's the same thing. We can have US firms and US leadership establishing the norms, building out the infrastructure, supporting the commercial activity, and then that can bring everyone else's commercial activity with them. Because again, when you're talking about a zone of activity that's measured in the trillions, a lot of people are going to want a piece of that. And so either we're providing the mechanisms by which they access that, or someone else, I can just say the word China, or someone else will. And they're going to make decisions, whether it's whether you categorize it as an extension of Belt and Road to Belt Road Moon, then that could be clever. Belt Road Moon, then that's what they're going to do, right? So we have to understand that if we want our systems in place, if we want to be able to incentivize our partners so that they can pursue their economic interests, we have to have that infrastructure.
Interesting. Favor, I've noticed that Bim, I hope I pronounced that correctly, in the chat is a budding economic graduate student, wants to pursue a career. You're the perfect person to respond. So do you mind offline in the chat room, maybe giving them some counseling? So thank you. And I love the BE audience. They always stand up. So we've got some good comments and questions, which I'll get to in a moment. So let me shift to you, Rose, and maybe weave into it the fact that the Office of Space Commerce had such a critical role in the whole world of space situational awareness, traffic management, and the associated issues with that. And as I alluded to earlier, that is cosmic in scope. So you, of necessity, have to cooperate in some measure with all nations going to space, let alone China and India. How are you in the office? How's the department approaching that?
Sorry, I was trying to throw I couldn't both drop a link and talk to it apparently. Well, so it's very concrete right now, and I think the Office of Space Commerce, we live in a very concrete world, you know. So big fans of a multi-trillion-dollar space economy, and it takes like individuals each acting, you know, independently in some ways to make that happen. So we're all about like laying down ramps, you know, to pull people up, you know, hands down the ladder to bring as many people into play as possible, because we need that. We need those individuals. We need Brim and all of his friends to be engaged. But looking at space situational awareness, space traffic coordination, yeah, it's a very crowded, very congested world. It gets, you know, we have more satellites than ever, and many planned, particularly as China starts launching successfully their, you know, mega constellations. So it has created an imperative where we really need to move forward on sharing information and just encouraging more transparent international system. You know, entities like the UN have been working on this for a very long time, but one of the challenges with such a huge and inclusive multilateral system is just slow, and it's very hard to get anything other than non-binding kind of pledges to do good things. So the U.S. has put down some real investments, about $70 million just this past year, to develop the track system, and it's called the Traffic Coordination System for Space. I included a link here. That is a real life physical operating system that we're building in order to be able to share and
by the way, Rose, I
share
think
information.
Your deputy director, the great Janice Starsek, I think she indicated you're actually initiating it right this week. Am I correct?
Yeah. This month, you know, we're flipping the switch on. It's with a smaller set of beta users, and it won't look wildly different yet because the interface is still being constructed. So we're approaching this kind of like Silicon Valley in the sense of an iterative process. So over the next year, but every quarter we'll add a new set of customers and new capabilities. So it should be like fully mature by the end of 2025. And we're also being very careful because the Department of Defense has had this mission previously based out of Vandenberg. And you know, really this was a thing they could do, you know, 10, 15 years ago when there just weren't that many satellites in space. And now there's so many, with the vast majority being civil and commercial, it's pulling them away from their security mission. So I think it was 100% the right call, not just because it's my office, but personally speaking, to more center that work in the civilian world. So that's why the Office of Space Commerce is taking over this mission, and it'll be a very slow and deliberate transfer because it's, again, a safety problem, and we really want to make sure there's total transparency and that people feel comfortable with trusting this data. It's even though this is the U.S. system and we absolutely have a global approach, we fully expect other countries to consider it to be a strategic imperative to have their own data. And so we see this as really a federated system where maybe Europe and China, India, Europe, whatever, Russia will have their own data, but we're trying as much as possible to, like through NIST and other forums, to move us toward, you know, a common set and a common baseline of what do we share. And of course, we are really trying, Kara, I heard your words earlier, to avoid that any type of collision and creation of further debris. And so that's why it's become such a priority and why, you know, we've been investing in this. So that's a set of good news, concrete good news. But of course, we need to be moving. I think we all feel like we need to be moving faster. And kind of in that pragmatic theme, it has been an area of potential cooperation with entities like China, because, you know, For example, I mean, they have their own space station with humans on board and in one of the most congested orbits, being Leo. So, we're all very interested in making sure that these humans stay safe. And so it's sort of created an opportunity for us to move forward on concrete cooperation to make sure we keep these humans safe. And then that has kind of a spillover effect of also helping us coordinate for all of the hard objects that don't have humans on board that are in orbit. So
Also,
we're on a good
Rose,
trend.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. Before I move to Kara, so it's a good reminder that as we have this discussion, you have taikonauts in orbit, and China's made no bones about expanding their in-orbit station capability. India, can you remind us what their timeline is on? I was sort of surprised when I became apprised of how quickly they're moving into the human spaceflight program. Can you give us just a real quick insight into the Indian human spaceflight effort? Rose, if you don't mind.
Or to me. Okay, sorry. Yeah, sorry, I missed. Yeah, well, I mean, I'm really excited to say that India is working with the United States to put some of their humans into space, and particularly to come to the ISS. So, George, it kind of alludes to the very, the destination for a long time now to go to space has been to the ISS, and it's really been quite invaluable for that role. So we're it really does show, kind of, as Peter was alluding to, the rapid pace that India is on, and how concrete they are being in those advancements. So it's a good development, and also glad to. Well, I think another thing that's really interesting is this model of India going to space is not strictly sort of the old world, agency to agency. It's blended in with commercial services. So it's through a combination of commercial lift and agency cooperation that this is happening. And I think it's like an example of our evolving ecosystem, So we're going from a world where it was the NASA's and the Roscosmos to now we've got, Axiom, SpaceX, all of these companies that have a role to play. And also countries no longer necessarily have to go through a government to cooperate. They can also business to business cooperation is happening, government to business cooperation. It's like the spider web is starting to fill out with these connections, and therefore becoming a little more dynamic, and ideally moving a little faster.
Gotcha. Kara, Kimberly talks about the Artemis program promising to return astronauts to the moon in the near future. But as Kimberly properly points out, the progress has been hampered by, among other factors, inconsistent funding, leadership changes. Every election cycle seems to bring a new set of goals, etc. Meanwhile, China, the rabbit in the hare analogy is moving along steadily, right? And I'm wondering, per your agenda, and thank you for, I know how long things can take to get approved at Aerospace Corp, so the fact you're able to announce it today is very meaningful. As you look through the agenda and those 20 some odd challenges that the United States needs to step up to, how do we deal with the fact that we're dealing with a pretty much an autocratic culture that can move fast, and we have the clumsy republic with the checks and balances and so forth, and the appropriation process, which can be an impedance. Just how do you talk about uncertainty? How do you manage that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the fact that, essentially NASA and Artemis has become the, political ping pong game for Congress is a really, I think we're seeing it. We're seeing, I think, how devastating it has in long-term planning. In terms of how catastrophic is it, let's say, if China gets, human boots on the moon before Artemis program gets up and running, I think that really is, I think, a bigger question to be, technically, I think the US government stance is like, well, we already done that. We're doing something different now. If they get there first, they're just following what we already did. I'm not sure that is an accurate statement. At the same time, I'm not sure we need to be crying chicken little. I think this gets back to what are our objectives and goals, and back to what George was talking about, which is like, we're really trying to create and generate an economy and a market that does not exist today. How do we do that? How do we make sure we do that so it's sustainably there? Like, not just for us, a quick snap in the pan and then it's gone. Like, how do we make sure that this is building up and feeding value back into those of us who are on Earth? Maybe not, maybe I'll be on the moon. I don't know yet. But, I think that to me is, there is absolutely, I mean, we cannot, I don't think we can discredit the fact that, like, at the end of the day, international treaties are nice, but norms of behavior trump all of that. And first mover does have advantage. And I think we do need to be very, very aware of that. Now, because this whole talk is and then your question was on opportunities, I actually think this quote unquote perceived crisis can absolutely work in the favor. It can work in the favor for getting through and accelerating all the things we know we need to do, but the bureaucracy has just kind of swallowed it up whole because we've gotten complacent, because we really haven't had real competition. And we haven't had a need to really articulate the why. Oh, we're going there because of science. No, that there are many, many reasons now, and they're all really important reasons, and they're urgent reasons, and we need to articulate that. So I think that opportunity can help us, I think, start to stoke the fires of the things that we already need to do. And I'll go back to some of the recommendations we had made, which is, where are the strategic kind of whole of government investments to make sure our private sector can get there? Like, we piecemeal everything, we make decisions, we don't talk to each other. We create these monopolies when we should be distributing and moving into small and medium businesses. So that's certainly one area. We talk a good talk with commercial, but have the budgets moved? No. You see every program get up in front of Congress and talk about how we don't have enough money. We can't even keep the lights on our current programs, let alone, dare I say, fund R&D and future programs and or hand any of that investment over to the commercial sector. So I think we need to have some accountability there on what we're really doing. And perhaps, again, we can't get to something different if we don't leverage our commercial sector. Just this is not going to happen. So hopefully these incentivize us to kind of cut through some of the status quo we've been enjoying for 60 plus years. And then I think
go
ahead.
Going to add, don't lose your train of thought there. But as you're speaking, and I'm thinking about where we are in this dialogue, and I'm looking at some of the comments and questions. These are really, really critical, in many ways, to use the cliche, existential challenges. And yet, as my good friend, colleague Scott Pace has mentioned, we often find ourselves in what he calls this sort of space ghetto, right? So we're having this urgent discussion, and yet if you pan out and you listen to the pundits or the latest reports on whatever your favorite network, the issue very rarely even pops up, and certainly in the town meetings with presidential candidates and so forth, it just never really comes up. And then it becomes sort of the secondary, tertiary issue, right? When the transition teams collect and they populate the different agencies, often we, those of us who work in the world of civil, commercial, and national security, can sometimes feel like, we're of secondary standing. So I don't expect anybody to have the answer to it, but just making that observation.
I think, if I can, Kara.
Kara, please don't lose your train of thought. I interrupted you. I'm sorry. Go ahead, George.
Well, I think Kara had something really important there, and you've pulled on it, which is we can't out centrally plan our adversary, and I don't think we should try. Right? Like, our advantage is in our ability to be a better central planner. That's not our advantage.
Yeah.
Our advantage is that we have the best and most vibrant financial markets in the world, and we are a trusted partner. If we can lean into those two things, we can do a lot. If we try to lean into centrally planning everything, we will lose. We're not going to out centrally plan them.
Yeah, I think.
Go ahead, Kara.
No, I think that's right on point. I will say, though, what we have lost, I would say, again, probably because of the lack of competition and other issues that have shown up, and the space economy isn't mature enough to garner the kind of interest we would see in other areas like artificial intelligence and biotechnology. We'll get there. I mean, absolutely. I would say without an articulated set of visions or aspirations, we can't really harness activity around that. And so I think I agree. It's not the planning that needs to be centralized. I think it's a collective conversation on why we're going. And it can be multiple answers. It's okay if we don't all agree, but like the fact that we're not having that process and discussion, and the fact that the president never puts space as a line item on their key priorities, that's a problem. And I think the value, again, this is that connection of value to the American people, and of course, broader global, value proposition that space can provide is going to be so important.
Jerry Passner asks, is the Wolf Amendment, which basically outlawed space collaboration with China, by and large, has it outlived its usefulness? After all, it's been law, for a couple of decades now. It's sort of part of this us versus them mentality, as Jerry points out. Should we, in fact, be trying to work more closely, collaboratively, as he mentions, with our only global space peer, which was not the case? Certainly, they weren't at the level they are when the congressman first introduced the amendment. Peter, what's your thoughts?
Whether or not we have the Wolf Amendment, I think, the question about, how do you structure a program that takes care of United States interests? I don't necessarily think that it's outlived its usefulness. On the other hand, you'd have to consider what's the potential harm of getting rid of it. And I think a lot of that comes down to how well educated NASA is to look for proliferation concerns. And if you go way back, to the commission that looked at, that really sort of kicked off ITAR, even though ITAR was a tremendous overreaction, it is amazing that we essentially, had activities that gave away capabilities that helped the Chinese to MIRV their vehicles, to go from being able to launch just a single nuclear weapon at us to putting multiple nuclear weapons on the same rocket, proliferated capabilities that helped them, improve all their shrouds, all their rockets and ballistic missiles, and hugely accelerated their program. And so, I think, Congress has reason to be skeptical that, that an agency that's looking to cooperate wouldn't be forward-leaning in sort of giving away our advantage. So depending on who was in charge of NASA, I think it would make a difference as to whether or not I thought you needed the check in Congress. Now, the Wolf Amendment doesn't bar collaboration, it just raises the bar so that there's a very significant series of questions that the agency.
That's a good clarification. Right. Anyone else, George? Anybody want to respond to that?
I won't respond directly to any amendments before Congress. But what I will speak to is existing systems in place that are proven effective in other similar situations. So if we look at Pegasus, aka now In-Q-Tel, and how that was authorized, that was a mechanism to stand up a government-run and sponsored nonprofit that would then invest and signal investment into cutting-edge technology that the intelligence community needed at the dawn of the .com, right? And without that, you could very effectively argue that Silicon Valley would not exist. And that's going to tick some people off. But I'll do the math with you if you want to sometime offline. And so if we wanted something similar, we already have a mechanism, right? We already know how we set up Pegasus. We already know how we did the OTA and how we got the In-Q-Tel set up and how we authorized it. We could do the same thing with something that is dedicated to signaling and strengthening the investments in space commercial activity and space commercial activity that will advance both goals of having a vibrant industrial base and a continued funding mechanism from the government, and thereby grabbing our Wall Street partners and also being able to advance technologies that'll give us the foothold and the lead in both instances. So I think there's mechanisms in place. I tend to stay away from the NASA budget conversation, but there are other mechanisms and there are other things that we could do by just cutting and pasting from things that have worked before.
Rose, any thing you want to add to that?
Sure. Well, just the qualifier, the Wolf Amendment doesn't apply to every organization in the United States. So
Right.
Commerce can talk to China, which we really need to, again, for the space situational awareness piece. And again, it's not a hard no. You just you have to make a good case for it and sure it's deliberate when we are cooperating. And then so I think it's a little bit of a problem actually that it is interpreted as a complete bar of any cooperation. At least that's how it can be received from the Chinese. So understanding that there are barriers put into place because of hard lessons learned, but that it's not impenetrable. there's ways to work, So I just wanted to mention that.
Okay, that's a very, very important point.
Mm-hmm.
Kara, any thoughts?
I think maybe I'll just mention that, again, we are not in the Cold War. China is not Russia. And the circumstances we find ourselves are very different. And, we don't have the kind of diplomatic and communicative, conduits with China as we used to have with the Soviet Union. And I think, space obviously played, especially the International Space Station, our space programs played a critical role, right, in developing that communication. And we don't have much of that with China. And I think that will, further exacerbate misperceptions and intent on different activities. I do think, back to George's point, the fact that they're largely looking at space as having economic value is a very good thing for us, as we have been very successful in economic relationships and trade with them. We are completely embedded. Our economies are embedded. So I think that is actually an incredible opportunity. I also I forgot to mention this at the beginning, but what kind of futurist would I be if I didn't talk about a science fiction film? So today's one that I'll point to is Blade Runner. It's one of my favorites. My dad just loved that movie and a big Harrison Ford fan. And he actually used to insure his helicopter, which is super funny. He was a terrible pilot, by the way. Not my dad. Harrison Ford crashed several times, but in that movie, right, it's all around this very dystopian Japanese led future.
Yep.
And so I just, it's not to say that, some of our projections are about China aren't going to be accurate. I just think we have to have some, remove ourselves from the arrogance of thinking that where we are today and those projections are really what the future is going to look like. And I'm so glad you brought up India, because I think India has incredible potential, as do the hundreds of other countries who have, aspirations to go into space. And I think, again, the value of technology and how rapidly things are evolving, we may see billion-dollar unicorns across the globe that are pushing space, and it may not just be US led. We don't know. And I think we just have to have those frameworks in mind as we're thinking about the development of space, as well as the interaction with great power state competition that we see today, including with China. So I would just flag that economic opportunity is one of which we can win many fights: the norms fight, the value to the American people fight, and of course, working with partners and maybe non-traditional partners as well.
Well said. I just want to bring to everybody's attention Ryan Faith, who's a good friend, and by the way, commiserates with you, Peter. He's also working his PhD thesis, so you could share your saga with him. But I thank you, Peter, for responding to his comments about the race. So those of you in the audience that haven't, I think it's worth looking at Ryan's observation, and my other friend, Dave Marsh, as well, brings up some very good points about looking at the developments in India, China, and the U.S. and putting it in context. And again, I thank Peter. Go ahead, George.
If I could broaden our lens just a little bit,
Please.
I think it's important that when we think about the expanding role of other nations, that we also start thinking about the other players involved beyond just India and China. So the reason I think that's important is for a number of reasons, but the first is if I was to be so inclined, and I had bought more Bitcoin earlier on, I had $5 billion. There's quite a few companies right now that would love to take my money and give me a space station. Okay. And so while I'm not so inclined and not so fortunate, there are a number of nations that could very easily seek out commercial partners who would put up a space station for them. And so this is important when we think about, again, the decommissioning timeframe of the ISS, the aspirations of China to probably put up a second, if not a third, space station while we're crashing ours. What's going to happen, right? So there are many nations within MENA, arguably Brazil, whereas JAXA are going to find their next partner where they could put up a space station. Okay. And so that will anchor their economic activity. And again, this is part of that infrastructure I'm talking about, an infrastructure that Space Force will protect, but a infrastructure that will be going up there. And so I don't think it'll obviously just be China and India. I don't think any of my contemporaries here believe that. But I think that you'll see interesting partnerships, right? Maybe as we lose the ISS, JAXA says, you know what, Brazil might be a great partner, or maybe someone in MENA is a great partner for them, and they come together to put something up, right? And I think that's very likely, particularly if we're going to cede our lead there and cede our foothold there.
That's really a profoundly important point you're making. I should also say that if indeed the station is allowed to re-enter in 2030, 2031 timeframe, and we don't have a very clear transition to another habitat, hopefully one of the commercial habitats that are on offer, to me that would be just a devastating, speaking for myself, a devastating message, I think, to the world as to U.S. leadership.
Well, we did it before, right? I mean,
we did it several times.
I'm not so young to not remember that we didn't have a way to get to our own space station that we share with our partners for a number of years, right? We had to hitchhike on the Suez. So we've done this before. We've sang this song and done this dance. And I feel like we're going to repeat it. I wish we weren't, but I think we are at this point.
Yeah. We're at 1:23, and I have a gazillion other questions to get into, but let me look at the audience here for a second. Boy, thank you all, the panelists, for putting in your links. So I do encourage, please, the audience to follow up. And some great, I'm just trying to look at some comments here. Well, I'd be remiss if I didn't, if I missed my friend Casey Dreyer from the Planetary Society. Hasn't the case for Artemis effectively been made? The program survived the Trump-Biden transition, looks almost certain to continue in the next administration, regardless of who wins. And even though Congress reduced NASA's budget, it preserved funding for Artemis. I see far more continuity and political support for Artemis, to the extent that there's a risk of losing the current quote-unquote race to the moon. It appears it's driven more by the fact that we're depending on U.S. commercial partners to develop radically new landing technologies required to access the lunar surface. The bigger issue to me, and raised by the recent Augustine report, is that we risk losing state capacity at NASA by too readily turning to the private sector for basic R&D and new tech rather than investing it in-house. Okay, see, that's a pretty provocative comment. Please, Peter, you're on mute. Go take yourself off. Yeah.
So, first, in terms of a race back to put boots on the moon, that's completely irrelevant, and who cares? The tasking in SPD-1 was for permanent and sustained presence, and that requires an architecture that can scale and provide regular access. It means that you've got to pursue reusability. And NASA essentially wasted an entire decade with and approaching $93 billion on the absolute wrong architecture of the Space Launch System, rather than using that $94 billion, which probably would have purchased the equivalent of 94 Starship equivalent projects. We could have been pursuing all manner of nuclear, thermal, nuclear electric propulsion. We could have had an advanced, space solar power. We could have amped up clips so that we were actually testing landing technologies as opposed to, putting, our science instruments on the first ones. So, a contract-based COTS-like approach, I think, could have much more rapidly started actually building up infrastructure over that period of time. And again, it's just not important in the long-term scheme of things that we repeat Apollo. If we're not going to have a sustainable, ever-expanding economic presence on the moon, it's an absolutely pointless program. It's not relevant for science. It's relevant for industrial development. And if your architecture is not slaved to producing an industrial civilization on the moon, all you are doing is wasting tax dollars. And having a government-owned capacity when we could, for the same price, fund at least 10, a portfolio of 10 commercial actors where we could spread risk would be much smarter than trying to own a government-designed rocket.
Given the late time here, it's 1:26. I have one final question, and we could take Casey and Peter's discussion and turn that into a couple more webinars. But let me ask you this. Given what you know about the state of the U.S. industry, what you know about what's happening abroad, again, in the human spaceflight area, the trends, the challenges, the context of your agenda, Kara. Let's say we have this discussion 20, 25 years down the road. What is give me two scenarios, a positive scenario, US and these other nations in space, what does that look like? And really, what's the worst case at this point if we don't step up the way that Kara talked about? And Kara, may I start with you?
Sure, why not? What did they? The phrase is always "you stand where you sit," right? So, I play in a lot of a very objective field. So I think in terms of like a U.S. lens, assuming big L leadership is desired, and assuming we want to carry on, freedom of trade and pro-democracy and all those things that we value into space with us. And hopefully learn from some of the mistakes we've made as well as we design those new things. I think, success is $1 trillion plus economy by that time. And lots of different technological and honestly humanitarian value added businesses and opportunities. Maybe we've solved cancer because of all the incredible biotech research that's happening in place. And I think, a negative one is probably not the obvious one. It's not, oh, that somebody else leads that. I think that it doesn't happen at all. I think that we constrain ourselves to Earth-based problems, thinking that by not going to space, we're going to solve Earth-based problems. And I think that is just completely false. I think space has and will continue to be the answer to humanity's, evolution in the positive direction.
George?
I like what Kara said. I would bring back some classics, right? So the allegory of the cave from Plato. If we're going to concentrate, we're going to concentrate on Earth problems. We're just looking at the shadows dancing before the firelight, not the sun behind us. So I really think that's apropos here. I think and I worry that without U.S. leadership, and U.S. leadership done in a way that promotes and advances U.S. commercial interests, that we will be overtaken in this space frontier, and both the economic significance of its growth outpacing that of world economic growth and its strategic significance, that's dangerous.
And apologies to the audience. We're going to bleed a little past that 1:30 mark because I want to hear obviously from Rose and let Peter close it out, and then we'll turn it over to Steve Wolf. Rose, any
Yeah, so I think we're gunning for Kara's positive scenario, where we're trying to bring, freedom, pro-democracy principles, and open market, to space. We want there to be to be a functional and dynamic world, and I think really we don't really know exactly how it's going to unfold, and we have to kind of get comfortable with that to some degree. It's we have to build a system that is flexible to change, which is part of the reason why in the here and now we're so focused on enabling environment. So trying to build those planks, build that ramp so we can make it smooth and ideally tilting toward this positive outcome as much as possible toward that safe, secure, predictable environment is also interoperable, that we have some like standards processes that we can like count on as we so we have these common points, as we diversify, as we experiment. And frankly, right now, I think our space ecosystem, this is kind of personally speaking, more from the CGD world, Center for Global Development, our space economy, our space ecosystem is still pretty young, and it's very Earth focused, right? And making that leap into that in-space economy is the real bridge that we're trying to navigate, and once we kind of get there, we're going to see, I think, another spurt of activity and diversification. And some of the government-led programs that are there that trying to support, for example, establishing destinations, this concept of a reef, if you have like an anchor, then ecosystem will develop around it is I think one that is useful. And we also are looking to figure out like where are those opportunities to sort of accelerate that process. But we have this collective, leap to make, and we're not right there yet. And I get very cautious about really big numbers being thrown around because it creates a dissonance with our political leadership. So like you're saying 1 trillion, 10 trillion, 50 trillion, whatever. How does it actually translate to the people who vote for me tomorrow? Like what does that mean, and how can I actually grab that in a concrete way? So we also have to keep this conversation grounded, to help people understand how it's relevant to them and what economic benefits are within the realm of the possible, while we're also setting up these long-term kind of anchor points for true evolution of our economy.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Peter, take it away. You started the conversation. It's appropriate for you to end it.
Well, let me start off with 2 negative scenarios and then try to paint a positive one. So the first negative scenario is that, there's some time of a global economic downturn. The United States decides it has to, tighten its belt. It reduces its investment in Artemis. The program falls apart. Something similar happens in China. They also dissipate their interest, and we go, at least another 2 decades, maybe 3 to get back where we are today. Similarly, you could imagine that environmentalist concerns, bog down and reverse Starlink. Starlink, fails, and with it, the funding mechanism for Elon Musk to go to Mars, and we essentially live in a much, less optimistic Earth-locked future for the next 30 years. A second bad scenario is not necessarily, bad for the economic development of humanity, but perhaps for its freedom, where the United States doesn't lead. It would look something like this. NASA has delayed Artemis 3 to 2029. It slips another year. China lands on the moon successfully in 2030 before the United States. The US Congress says, enough of that, we're not going to race for second place when we've already won the first time. It cancels Artemis. All the Artemis partners have to go somewhere else. China succeeds in its Long March 9 Starship clone, starts putting down the initial infrastructure on the moon. All of our former Artemis partners see that that is where the game is. And so the global, shifts in that direction. They essentially extend their one belt, one road type of philosophy to lunar development. And in 2 decades, we've got, a lunar base that's, got a mass driver shooting out, thousands of metric tons to build solar power satellites and send back helium-3 to the Earth. China dominates the energy economy, having its hand on the light switch for Europe and Asia, as well as all of, essentially having the dominant power projection platform from space to Earth. essentially meaning that it becomes the hegemon and everybody else has to comply.
Now that you depressed us, can you give us something
Yeah.
positive?
So, the final one is that, the next administration and Congress put a priority on space, not space exploration, but space economic development. And they develop both the internal and external tools and priorities and the incentive structure for our private industry. And whether or not SLS gets canceled, it gets eclipsed by Starship and other actors that allow us to have a tremendous amount of mass. One or more of the startups finds a compatible presidential and congressional environment for solar power satellites. We see a boom in in-space assembly and manufacturing. We see a boom on the moon, and it's of such a scale and pace and competitiveness that we stay ahead, bridging from the moon to the asteroid belt, allowing 50 terawatts of green energy in geo, and an untold amount of vast metallic resources that enable us to start to build O'Neill colonies, start to expand humanity's habitat into space, and as Bezos says, sort of zone the Earth green residential. And we're leading that, making sure that economic and political freedom is the basis for the in-space economy.
That's great. Thank you. I'm going to end it on that very positive note. Thank you all very, very much for your time, and the audience for your wonderful inputs and your patience as we went past the 1:30 mark. Steve, Wolf, I turn it back to you.
Hey, Courtney, and if everyone will stay on for just a moment, I want to just express, Courtney, a masterful moderation of an extraordinary discussion.
They make it easy, Steve.
With this incredible panel you have. Peter, you have summed up for us and the audience what is at stake, right, in terms of the policy, and this is all policy driven, right? The United States, it's not up to, yes, the private actors do have a large role in this, but the government has to be part of that process. If the United States is going to maintain leadership, it is essential that they step up in terms of embracing an aggressive economic policy in space, and LEO and cislunar and so forth. There's so many takeaways from this discussion. You've really outlined what the challenges are and the potential is. We are definitely entering into a highly competitive environment, and hopefully it is peacefully competing, in that we recognize there are shared concerns that Rose highlighted in terms of situational awareness. No one should want to be hit by a piece of debris, and we all would need to work together in that regard and for our safety and concerns of any humans that are in space. But Peter points out that this has to be, we need to develop new relationships with our allies and partners, and work together aggressively. George so artfully talks about aligning the financing and reorganizing our all of government approach to enabling the financing to enable the kind of investment that we need for this to grow. And Kara, you are so on point in terms of that we need the vision that has to pull us into the future, if you will, and that's where Beyond Earth, of course, is. We see this vision, and how do we pull us into that future? What are the changes that we can make now and the policies that will get us there? So look forward to digging into the report and the 20 recommendations that you're about to put out. As Courtney says, we are about to release 5 papers of our own on a variety of policy issues and so forth. I really do hope that all of you will join us at the Beyond Earth Symposium. Seating is limited, so you will need to sign up soon to ensure your seat. It will close out well before the start date. And so with that, thank you all again for joining us, and we will see you next time. So thank you. Thanks again to our panel and to Courtney.
Thank you all.
Okay, bye now.
Bye.